virtually today, what I'd like to do is acknowledge that there'll be people joining us from a range of locations across Australia and perhaps even the world. And so just to give you an idea as to the lands across Australia on which we meet, I'm sharing my screen now, which shows an Indigenous map of Australia. And so here in Canberra, I'm joining you from Ngunnawal country. And our guest today, Rebecca Scott, is joining us from Melbourne down here. Your land, Beck, is?
Wurundjeri. So the Kulin Nations, and we're Wurundjeri land.
Okay. So you can see from this map that there are many Indigenous lands across our nation, and it's important that we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. All right, some housekeeping for today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right, so housekeeping for today. The session will go for about 1 hour. The first 30 to 35 minutes will be a conversation between Beck and I. In the first part of and then in the second part of the session, we'll have question and answers from people who are participating online today. To ask a question, you have a button at the bottom of your Zoom window called Q&A. So you can bring up that box and you can ask a question in that box. You can ask it at any time throughout the webinar, but we'll have a special session at the end dedicated to question and answers. So let me tell you a little about myself and a little about our guest today, Rebecca Scott. So my name is Sally Curtis. I work at the Australian National University in the Research School of Management. And what I'm interested in is social problems, wicked social problems, things like climate change, poverty, inequality in all its forms, gender, racial inequality. These are all forms of wicked social problems. And what I like to do is help people and organisations with social problems through research and education. And what excites me most about what I do is using evidence to address social problems. And I'm lucky to work at the ANU, where what we do is create and share evidence to help leaders and organisations address wicked social problems. Today, I'm joined by a leader with loads of experience tackling wicked social problems. Rebecca Scott, or Beck Scott, as she likes to be known. Beck and I met about 20 years ago working together at the CSIRO, Australia's national science agency. And of course, this is an agency where lots of innovation occurs. From here, Beck went on to start her own social venture, her own social enterprise in Melbourne called STREAT. STREAT's a hospitality enterprise that's been set up to stop youth homelessness. It's an award-winning social enterprise that has been operating now for more than 10 years. In March this year, yes, just when this pandemic started, Beck instigated Moving Feast. Moving Feast is a collective approach to changing the food system in Australia. Now, what I love about Beck's story is that as an academic, I'm interested in kind of typologies and thinking about leaders who are instigating social innovation from different places. And so if I, again, share my screen with you, let me just get this right. So here I have the kind of typology of who instigates social innovation. And what I love about Beck's story is that she's been in each of these boxes. So starting at CSIRO as a social entrepreneur, leading social change from within the bounds of an organisation. She's also been a social entrepreneur where she created STREAT and her own venture. And now she's moved into being a systems entrepreneur. And the systems entrepreneur is someone who leads system-wide change. And that's going to be our focus today, looking at the partnership that Beck has instigated to look at changing the food system in Melbourne and Victoria in Australia. So really exciting stuff. Systems change is not easy to do, and I can't wait to hear from Beck about what she's doing in this space today. So Beck, I'm going to hand over to you and get you to introduce yourself and also introduce Moving Feast, which is what we're here to talk about today.
Sure, thanks, Sal. I guess you would say in one way, Sal, that, you know, I've kind of come quite a length in that kind of 20 years since we first met at CSIRO. But actually, if I think back to the things that we're doing, you know, the traits of a social, you know, intrapreneur and a social entrepreneur and a systems entrepreneur, there are many, many kind of overlapping traits in all of those in a Venn diagram. And I think even if you're doing social entrepreneurship, most people probably have a natural level that they sit at. So certainly I would say, without knowing and having the language for it kind of back then, I wouldn't have even known I was an entrepreneur, let alone an intrapreneur. So a lot of this kind of language evolves and understanding evolves. But the kind of traits that I knew that I loved, I just loved building stuff. And wherever I was, I wanted to keep kind of moving into a bigger and bigger system. And I remember saying to my boss, my first boss at CSIRO and my very first job, within CSIRO education, I'd never heard of a strategic plan or didn't know any of that stuff, and asked him about it and said, I know that, you know, I'm sitting on level 2, but I know there's all these other people in all of these other parts of the building. Do you mind if I go and find out about what all of them do? And him telling me that I couldn't go wandering through the building and find out what everyone did because it would just be a distraction from my job. But there's those of us, I think, who will always naturally want to go bigger and bigger and bigger and sit kind of, you know, we always kind of end up at the level that we're comfortable at, I think, working. And I would say that probably right from the beginning, I've always liked that meta stuff, you know, the high level frameworks, the meta stuff. How do you bring together lots of different disciplines to solve really complex problems? And so at probably all 3 levels that I've operated at, the one defining feature or the characteristic that rings true across all of those would be always cross-disciplinary practice. It's always trying to bring a really big, diverse group of people and actors to the table to try and address these problems, however small or large you're bounding your system. So the last decade I've been working kind of building a social enterprise, but it really started because I was frustrated really that homelessness was being seen as a housing issue, not as a bigger challenge. And so I just wanted to cut my teeth and build something. But right from day one, our strategic plan as an organisation had, innovate and share that and generously share that knowledge back into the system to build a bigger system. So that has always been in the DNA of the organisation. Probably and I had very much told my founding board at the very beginning, I'm in for 10 years building this thing. I want to see if it's possible to build these things. We haven't got a lot of scaled social enterprises around the country, but I reckon it's possible. So I'm going to give it a crack for 10 years, and here's my goals. And I said, we'll reevaluate at the end of that 10 years. That 10 years came to an end at the end of last year, and I got to the point that I was pretty happy with. We were 90% self-funded, or almost 90% self-funded, helped a lot of young people over that decade, and had proved that you could scale, a social enterprise model to be quite substantial by the sector terms. So we have got 11 hospitality businesses in our portfolio, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids we've trained. So I was really comfortable knowing that the system, that we'd built an organisation and that organisation could be sustained. And then with my board's blessing, said I'm on my way to go and do systems entrepreneurship. and handed over the reins of the organisation from a business as usual perspective to our deputy CEO, and then moved into system work. So I guess I've been doing this as kind of my full-time part of my job, not just part of it, full part of it since kind of last year. And we as an organisation had already mapped out our 2040 strategy. So we've been doing a lot of systems thinking, a lot of frameworks, and very much looking at where could the organisation kind of be leading change in 2040. So when the pandemic came around, I'm kind of at the beginning of the year watching all of these countries start to fall with this wretched pandemic. I guess what became really clear is that there was going to be this enormous disruption in the system, and everything about the world was going to change. And for those of us who are entrepreneurial, disruption, brings opportunity as well. So I, speed dialed a whole bunch of friends really quickly in the social enterprise sector and said, how are you tracking? What do you think is going to happen to your organizations? And it became really clear, I guess, most social enterprises aren't big. They don't have big balance sheets. They don't have, lots of assets. They don't have, cash reserves. And so that real concern that we were going into a time when it was highly likely we were going to lose a lot of social enterprises. And starting to think, well, what would it look like if we started to build a system response and actually tried to help each other, not only kind of stay open, but we know that we've got an enormous amount of challenge coming through the system. And so the way we threaded this collective of people together was through the food system. And I guess I'm particularly interested in food systems because whatever lens you put over the challenges that we've got in the world at the moment, whether or not, the biggest one obviously being climate change, climate change is a way bigger challenge than we've got right now than the pandemic. So making sure that whatever we're working on now, if you're thinking about kind of an acupuncture needle, that you're putting the acupuncture needle not just through the short term, but right through, through into the long term work that you're doing. So you want to make sure that work is disruptive and it's creating the change you want in a way bigger system longer term. But if I look at human health, or I look at inequality, or I look at climate change, whichever lens I look through those problems, if I look at multiple systems in kind of together and put all those systems against each other in a big Venn diagram, the food system keeps on coming up as so critical to the survival of our species. And what I'm interested in is, how do you find those kind of multi-sector or multi kind of the layers of systems together, and the solutions that affect many parts of the onion ring. And so the food system, I guess, I'd already in my head moved very much from thinking about being a hospitality organisation to being a food system organisation. So that wasn't new thinking. But I guess the opportunity to bring together a whole heap of peers, and one of the nice things about being in Melbourne now for a decade, kind of building this, we know everyone who's in the sector, or most of the players in the sector, and certainly all the food players. So I'll just share my screen and just give a really just a kind of overview of who is in there. But the group, essentially, Moving Feast is a collection of organisations, and you'd say a movement of for-purpose enterprises working towards a fair and regenerative food system for all people in Victoria. So at the moment, it's a very state-based system, and it's got kind of three layers of goals. So a fair food system, a regenerative food system, and a connected food system. And each of those kind of three big goals has areas of work. Each was kind of three areas of work that we're focused on. And in the first instance, it was just speed dial friends, that we knew that we would want to be in the sandpit with and start doing stuff quickly. And we really didn't want to just do kind of short-term work, like I said earlier, but we could see that there was a huge, the pandemic had thrown up all of these food insecurity issues. So it made no sense that we were about to close these doors of all of these social enterprises who had amazing kitchens and chefs and, production capability at the same time as we were about to go into more hunger, with a whole heap of different stakeholders across the city. It just made no sense. So that first collective of social enterprise partners at the moment is a very Metro Melbourne group, because that's where our population is. But what we were trying to do is essentially just say, let's integrate our work and thread ourselves together in an end-to-end solution. So I kind of call it dirt to doorstep. Let's bring the social enterprise farmers alongside, the social enterprise logistics and delivery services along, to the social enterprise hospitality and catering and groups that can kind of make lots of meals, back through to kind of the communities who need it, whether or not you're working through community organizations or straight to households. And let's just try and integrate those things all along the way. So we've sprinted hard. We've done kind of something like 80,000 meals so far this pandemic, 20,000 meal boxes, and we have tons and tons and tons of produce that's just starting to come out of the ground now, because we planted 750,000 seeds at the very start of the pandemic, and now it's all ready for tons of it ready for, well, we've already started harvesting it. So we harvested, I think, 3,000 head of bok choy on Monday. So part of what we're doing is really trying to target where the food need is. The thing that is interesting, though, when you put those, put the things that we're doing into a kind of impact framework, this is just an example, so I've just given you the top level. So that first impact area, a fair food system, those 3 goals that we've got. I guess what we've done is... You might
want to, sorry to interrupt, you want to move on to the next slide. You're in, you might want to just move into presentation mode.
Thank you.
On your PowerPoint. That's okay?
Is that what you mean? Have you only got part of my screen?
We've got your whole screen, but we're only seeing your first slide.
Okay.
I think you're talking to your second slide. Not yet. So if you go...
I'm sorry, everyone. I feel like such a Luddite. I like driving systems, but I can't drive a damn Zoom call.
I know. So you could go back to your presentation.
I'm actually going to share in. I'm going to share in PowerPoint. So yep. Did you see this slide?
No, that's what I think you're trying to share with us. That's awesome.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. Thanks for your patience. So our food system essentially has 3 goals. So fair food system, regenerative food system, connected food system. And then within each of those, there's kind of 3 areas of work that we're working in. So you can see then how we're threading together, whether or not you're an environmental social enterprise, whether or not you're a food security social enterprise, whether or not you're a logistics, you fit in here. And so what that looks like from a system perspective is, essentially trying to line us all up in a process perspective and integrate our work. So, if you get a meal delivered on your doorstep, as part of the pandemic, every part of our system is doing, social and environmental good. And so part of the work is to just try and move us from working in silos to that kind of full system integration. But if you look at it from a kind of against an SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals perspective, this is where I get really excited about it, because what you've got is you can start to map all of these, things that we're trying to do across a way bigger system, and then you've got kind of global indicators of success for these things, and then I don't expect anyone to be able to read this, but essentially what I'm pointing out is the spaghetti. The thing that gets exciting about a food system project is that you can see it maps against many, many parts of many of the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can be doing, that long-term strategic work at the same time as you're doing some kind of emergency relief work, but that connectivity, and that's where I guess I get really excited. It's the hyper connectivity in systems that for choosing the right constellation of projects within that system, you can be addressing a lot of things, a lot of challenges at the same time. So I guess, and then what we've done, I guess, is say, well, any system has got a lot of levers that you can use. Once you're in that system, what are the ways that you're creating change within them? So even within an individual project, starting to say, well, what are the things that, the design of the project or the sub-project that sits within this bigger collective, how do you set up the right type of project design, the right measurement and evaluation, the right levers that are being used in that project? So this is just an example. It goes a lot deeper than this in our impact framework. But if you take, for example, we might choose the second column across, we might say, well, we're going to do a behaviour change intervention, and we're going to do a campaign for the general public to try and get the general public understanding why they should go to farmers markets instead of going to Coles and Woolies every week. And if you go to a farmer's market and you buy from a regenerative farmer, let us tell you what you change in this system and the impact you create. So there's so many kind of different mechanisms that you can use. And we lean quite heavily, just by way of background for those of you who don't know the behaviour change wheel, we lean quite heavily. We're a very behavioural science capable team, I guess. We've got 2 behavioural scientists as part of our team. And so this is a really good model for those who haven't used it before. But what it does is it really starts to look at the type of problems that you're trying to address and the different interventions you can do and the levers that you've got. And it's all evidence-based of, how do you try and address, large scale change. So where we're at, we're still 6 months young, so it's a very, very new system, but I'm super excited about what's possible. For those of you who aren't in Victoria, but might have been watching the news, you'd know that we're in 3rd stage of lockdown, but we've had a hard lockdown for people in our public housing, tenants and high rises this last kind of month. And we've really shown, I guess, the ability to spring into action very, very rapidly now as a system. But what gets really interesting, I guess, is, what are the things that we're going to be doing in this next decade collectively? And we're doing a lot of that planning now. What does it look like to really be doing deep transformative change, through the food system? I'll hand back over to you, Sal.
Thank you, Beck. And wow, just the level of thinking that has gone into this, I think, is extraordinary. And just that one slide that you're showing us now, each slide, I think we could probably have a webinar on the slide. What I love about you and the STREAT team and the Moving Feast collective is the way that you use literature and you use frameworks to guide your thinking. There's a lot of rigor and a lot of consideration and thought that goes into the work that you do. And as an academic, I love that. And I think, anyone who's out there interested in social change, there's always something we can learn from the literature and from people who are working in this space. And I love the rigor that you guys undertake in doing the work that you're doing. And so I guess that's a nice lead in then to look at one such framework that I know is very close to your heart and that has you've been using as a way of kind of looking at where you want to take STREAT and where you want to go strategically. And that model, I'm just going to share my screen again. Sorry. The model is Bill Sharp's 3 Horizon framework. And I'm just going to share, see if I can share my screen. Here we go. I'll get rid of that. Right, so Bill Sharp's 3 Horizon framework is, I've heard Bill refer to it as 3 lines on a page. And I guess that's exactly what it is, with an X and a Y axis. And so, across the bottom is time, and across up on the horizontal axis is prevalence. So time and prevalence. Prevalence means what are the dominant patterns? So from kind of least dominant through to highly dominant. And the 3 lines on the page are what he refers to as Horizon 1, business as usual, Horizon 2, disruptive innovation, and Horizon 3, the emerging future. And so this is a strategy tool. It's a framework for facilitating conversations about where an organization or a movement might like to disrupt and take things in the future. And so each of the lines, I'll just explain what each of the lines mean in my own words, and hope that I do Bill Sharp justice. And so H1 is fairly self-explanatory. H1 is business as usual. And so in this way of thinking, it's about trying to bring about transformational change, okay? So this framework is to help with transformational thinking. I should have said that. And so there's an assumption that is underpinning this model that H1 business as usual is not sustainable, okay? There are elements of H1 business as usual that need to change over time. So that's Horizon 1. Horizon 3 is where I'll go next. Horizon 3 is the emerging future. So we might see evidence of, if we look at a particular domain area, say in energy or in a particular technology area, where there's bits of the future that are starting to emerge. And so this is about thinking what does the emerging future look like, and getting organizations to think about where they want to be in very long time horizons. So Beck will probably talk about a 40-year time horizon, and that's the kind of time horizon that we're looking to think about using Sharp's framework. So that's H1 and H3. H2 is disruptive innovation. So disruptive innovation typically are those things that are occurring in the external environment to the organization. And, this can be natural disasters. It can be new technology. The smartphone was a good example of a disruptor. And of course, at the moment, the pandemic is the obvious one that is disrupting the way that we do things and business as usual. And so what this framework encourages people to do is to think about the disruptive innovation that's occurring. And rather than changing patterns in the way that we do things to enhance business as usual, it's trying to change patterns in the way we do things to generate the emerging future that we're trying to imagine, and the vision that we have for the emerging future. So it's about thinking in patterns and patterns of behavior, and getting us to consider that we don't want business as usual patterns in many cases, even though there are things that we need to continue to do. We don't want to throw everything out at once, but it's getting us to think about how do we use a disruptive event or a disruptive innovation in order to get us to the future that we imagine. And so, Beck, I hope I've done Sharp's framework justice.
You have, Sal.
You're going to talk about how you've applied this framework in practice. And as I said, I love that you and the people at STREAT and your board have been so rigorous in the way that you go about thinking about the emerging future and the disruption and business as usual. So with hopefully an understanding, a quick overview of the framework, I'm going to hand back to you to talk about how you've used this framework to imagine a different type of food system in Victoria.
Great, thanks, Sal. I might just share my screen. So what I tend to do a lot is use different frameworks kind of as different kind of lenses to look through stuff. And one of the things, okay, can you see my screen again? So I'm back on the behavior change wheel. Great.
Got it. Yep.
So if I take this,
sorry, I've got the screen at the moment is early social enterprise partners.
Okay, so are you on Bill Sharp's model now?
Not yet.
Oh, damn this thing. So I'm on a totally, okay, that's all right. I'll go this way. And are you seeing a full slide on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Fantastic. So there's a really good.
There he is.
Great.
Yep.
So the model, the way that Bill uses it is he's got a whole heap of kind of points along those trajectories that are quite significant, and what you're doing at those points to bring about the disruption, and he's got a process by which you go through to ask yourself questions of the past and of the future. And so I'm particularly interested on the screen of where kind of J and L are. So that's where I would say I do most of my work. So J, the question that you're asking when you're there is, what is it that's being disrupted? What are the things that you're trying to change? And then L is then what are the bits of the red, the H1, the red horizon, so the business as usual. What are the parts of those that you want to keep, but you want to extend that red line and keep those things in the future for longer. But then you're also asking of that green line, so the emerging future, what are the things that you want to pull up faster, from here up into the dotted disruptive future. And there's a whole heap of things that you can do. So the point between J and L is essentially, not only disruption, but it's the scaling of disruption as well. So there's a whole heap of things that you could do to be trying to kind of speed that up. So, those strategies might be collaboration and networks. They might be large scale movement building. They might be those behavioral change interventions, the sort of stuff that's on that behavior change wheel. Might be kind of whole new ways that you open up access to capitals or, large scale new policy. So I'll kind of use this model as one lens, I guess, to kind of ask myself questions all the way along there. And for those who haven't used this model before, Kate Rayworth has a really good introduction to this model on YouTube, where she goes through and she essentially steps through every one of those points and the questions that you need to be asking yourself. So jump onto YouTube and just look Kate Rayworth 3 Horizons model, and you'll get some gold. But if you're thinking, I've got probably the other model that I use a lot is what's called transition theory or system transition work, where, if you think about the longer that we leave climate change, for example, the longer that we don't address it, the more disruptive that the transition's going to have to be to get us into the safe zone. So if we leave it to the last minute, it's just so incredibly disruptive. And so I'm interested in the science, particularly around transitions. And the other one that I would look at a lot is, so if you think of systems, there's a lot of things that this is a city system, but the transition pathways that I use a lot, it's Gills and Schott work, and it's called multi-layer perspective, so MLP. And what it says is kind of at that lower level, it's essentially a micro, meso, macro view of the world and the systems kind of within it. So kind of down at that lower level here, you've got that kind of niche level and that's really all your individual organizations and your individual actors, and they're all kind of working down there at the ground. And the further up the system you go, the more structure that you get. So the next level up, those patchwork or regime level, it's called, that's where you start to get kind of structuring of the different groups. So those circles, here, they might be industry bodies or peak bodies or particular kind of groupings. But that's where governments often act, that they'll be stimulating certain industries or trying to put in policy levers. And then kind of right up the top here in the landscape level, that's kind of your whole of system. It's the whole community. It's kind of what I think of as the zeitgeist. It's kind of everything. It's culture. It's everything that's happening. But if you look at that system another way, this is the same system but just drawn kind of through the side. There's really different approaches that you take at the different levels in the system. So if you look down at that niche level down here, these are all the individual little actors. The way that you change the system at the niche level is by starting to get more and more of those actors moving together. So I always kind of think of that as, that what you used to do as a kid in that experiment where you put some iron filings on the top of a paper, and then you put a magnet underneath, and you start to drag all those iron filings along together. The more that you can start to get kind of movement in a similar direction and coordination and synchronization, the more pressure that you can exert kind of upwards on the rest of the system. And normally radical innovation happens from this lower level, and it's groups of actors operating together that start to create those kind of bigger changes. So you might get, a bunch of people in garages programming away, doing tech solutions, but before you know it, and you've got enough of them, you've got Silicon Valley, and you've got a whole bunch of people that are, innovating together. At that next kind of regime level, you change that part of the system by things like incentives, and you kind of leave things to market forces. But how you might do that, the government in here in Victoria is doing that at the moment, for example, through social procurement policy. So a whole heap of social enterprises like ours are, getting lots of, contracted business through government, but through policy. You can disrupt that middle part of the system also by new technology coming in and disrupting, and then you can start kind of exert pressure in certain kind of groups. So then once again, that might be whole sectors moving together to do things. Then if you go up to this top level, how you create change up at this level, normally change happens up there. It's really slow and long term. It feels incremental. But the other way that it happens is exactly what's happening now, with a massive rapid shock. It's this kind of shock here. And so I am, whilst, the world is being devastated and I wish we weren't in this pandemic, obviously a massive shock puts lots of other things into the system that are disrupted, that gives up lots of opportunities. So I'm interested, what are the particular set of opportunities that we've got right now? Because we've got this shock at the top level. We have government and the whole groups kind of, trying to do a bunch of things. But what does it look like if we start to get all of these niche level actors really getting their shit together and starting to kind of work from this level as well? That's where I get excited. I do think, though, it's worth mentioning that any system change that you're trying to do is imbued with values, that you bring a whole bunch of assumptions to that change, and the value of trying to make those assumptions explicit. This is an example of some work that was done by the CRC for low carbon living a number of years ago, and I think it's a really good example of some of the things that we often don't put on the table in our assumptions for where change should come from. So, do we believe that change should be bottom up and that the community does it itself? Or do we think that it should be top down and centralized? Do we think that change should be driven for public benefit and for public good? Or do we think it should be done for profit? And when you go in each of those different directions, you get really different solutions. You get different types of actors. The system looks fundamentally different because each of these are a pathway, or the connectivity or the ways that you put these things together become different pathways. So I don't expect anyone to be able to read this at all, but this is just an example. Each of those 4 different areas are the columns. for address massive climate change being addressed at the community level through this CRC. But I will always lean highly towards where the two green arrows are. Networked entrepreneurial living and community balanced living is what they've called it. But the actors are different. You know, in here, I want our change to be driven by social entrepreneurs. I want the values to come from kind of doing good and doing well. You know, down here, you know, the key advocates, social entrepreneurs, makers, hackers, community balanced living. That's my other big one. And I want I want the middle of all this. I want it to be very much a commons based way of addressing. I want citizens to be highly engaged in this stuff. You know, the values that sit in there for me are kind of egalitarianism and fairness and well-being and connectedness. So when you're thinking about systems, trying to make explicit those assumptions that you're bringing to the table of who do you even think should be making these changes and where do you sit in the system yourself? And so really, I think when you start to do that work and you start to make explicit all of those things, you start to give yourself pathways. So in my mind, what you're doing is you're creating the vision of the future that you want. But once you start to make some of those other explicit assumptions, you know, or those underlying assumptions explicit, you start to give yourself some really clear lines of how you can work through. And then the other thing, I guess, finally, that I would say before we go to Q&A is, I tend to try and often go where the energy is. So you're not plotting out a path that's, you know, an enormous project plan. You're not saying, well, here's 2040 and here's the project plan to get to it. You're setting a long-term audacious goal, but you're going where the energy is as well. So you're allowing a high level of emergence and you're going where, you know, it's not a straight line, it's a meandering line. It's tracking in a direction rather than a defined concreted in path. But you're going where there's energy and actors and you're building the momentum through energy. So at a personal level, you know, I would say my style of leading system change is a very, you know, passion-driven, energized, positive future, you know, approach. Whereas other systems, you know, leaders might very much take a Malcolm X. I drive from anger and you know, the tone or culture of that system change might be quite different. So I tend to like to be audacious in the goals that we're setting, but really get some excitement and momentum. And then probably the only other thing that I would add there is what I think is absolutely critical is that we build open innovation systems. We don't just keep these things highly bounded and just say, well, these people are the ones who can help. But we actually say, well, how if you're a household, you know, if you're a next door neighbor in a household or a big corporate, how can you get involved in this system? So making the boundary of the system semi-permeable, so a lot of knowledge can flow in and out. And we know of system change, the number one, you know, thing, the currency, the most precious currency in system change is knowledge. It's not money, it's knowledge. So how do you maximize the amount of people that are in there with knowledge? So that's me, I think, Sal.
Thanks so much, Beck. Yeah, I mean, you've given us so much to think about there and, you know, lots of detail about systems and systems thinking and what we know about systems, the interconnected nature of systems. And so if I could summarize what Moving Feast is about, you're about, you know, in your diagram, it's kind of grassroots change is what you're looking at. You're looking to try and bring about grassroots change in changing the food system in Victoria in order to then influence the other levels of the system. Yeah. Can you, I'm going to move to questions from the audience soon, but what I'd love to hear about is kind of some practical examples about how Moving Feast is doing that, how you talked about the prototype that you're currently working on and that you have in place. Could you give us an example of what Moving Feast is doing at the moment.
I'll give you an example. So when I mentioned at the front end of the pandemic, we planted over 750,000 seeds. We're now ready to harvest much of that food, and so the decision, we've got a decision to make, and if you've got all this food in the ground, so we made a decision that it was important to have food coming through, not just be buying food, to be connecting up growing to cooking. But the decision, for example, in how do you distribute that food? If you've now got tons and tons and tons of, organic, regeneratively grown food, where do you put that into the system? Now, do you put that into the system back into our kitchens to make ready-made meals for low socioeconomic communities? Do you put it into produce boxes and get it to those same communities? Do you hand it all over to the existing food relief system? Do you take a bunch of it and turn it into value-added product because we're social enterprises and we trade on the marketplace? So do we make it into amazing things and sell those things that give us a revenue stream to keep doing good stuff as well? And those sorts of decisions, I think, it's a very at the moment, what we did at the start of the pandemic is commission a piece of research to be able to say who is going to be at more risk of hunger during this pandemic. So we went out and we mapped, we did essentially a mapping of the groups that were going to be most at risk. So from a beneficiary perspective, we know the groups that are most going to be suffering from hunger through this pandemic. But we also did essentially the heat mapping of Victoria. So we know every local government area that's going to be really struggling. And so what we're doing now is essentially the piece of research that takes the beneficiary groups that we know that are most at risk, along with the local government areas that are the hotspots for those groups, and then going out to them, map that against what are the community organisations that are working with those groups in those areas to do a very targeted intervention and saying, okay, that's where we prioritise food in this system. So it can be anywhere from, how do you grow some stuff, what are you going to do with that stuff? How do you let the science and data, give you good decision making, through to, at the moment we're investing in platform integration and tech systems. So if a farmer, on the other side of the state is growing, masses of pumpkins and wants to be part of this and part of a regenerative food system, that we can get line of sight back in the city of all of that produce that's coming through the system, that we can access in a wholesale way. So some of it's kind of housekeeping system work, some of it's actually just getting food out there, some of it is long-term integration, social enterprise system stuff as well. So we've got tentacles in all directions.
I could see that there's just so much activity and so much going on with what you're doing. I heard you say in a talk recently that, one of the things you might be able to do is create a social enterprise supermarket and compete with Woolworths and Coles. And that was an idea that got me excited, because we all, kind of cringe at the thought of going to Woolworths, because we know how much that the farmers are losing out in that supply chain. Do you want to talk about that idea?
Yeah, I mean, it's, obviously it's a long-term goal, and Coles and Woolies shouldn't be worried right now that we're going to disrupt their business model, but that's the plan, long-term, obviously. I think part of doing system change is starting to just do little things that then can become bigger things. So right now, for example, we're looking at all the retail products that the social enterprises who are participating in Moving Feast, and there's about 20 of us at the moment, but about 80 across the state that we will be engaging with over time. So what are all the the retail products, whether or not that's produce, whether or not that's longer shelf life product, whether or not that's ready-made meals, and how would you package those things together, to in a retail perspective, whether or not that's, do you create ethical version of Uber Eats that's online? Do you create, physical shops where people can go to? Do you start trying to get more farmers markets and be putting more and more kind of fair and regenerative, produce and meals through that? All of those are great strategies. And so in the first instance, it's just starting to map what we've got. If you start to aggregate all the products across all of our enterprises, do you have enough in the first instance for a pop-up store? And it might be a tiny little pop-up store. Maybe we don't even have enough in the first instance for a pop-up store. Maybe we've only got enough for a hamper, So, okay, we've only got enough for a hamper this season. Let's start getting hampers out there and building a market for them. So just to give you a sense, we're making 700 hampers in the next 2 weeks. So, but what a hamper might be now, by Christmas might be a pop-up store. By next year might be the first tiny little grocer that we've got. 2 years later, it might be, the first tiny little supermarket. So each of these ideas, just need to, you just got to play, you got to experiment and there's, I guess, because there's just so much disruption at the moment, most of our organizations have nothing to lose in experimenting. And I kind of see JobKeeper essentially as R&D money. Most of our business models, our doors aren't open, our cafe doors aren't open as an organization right now, but we can use that JobKeeper money for testing ideas and innovation activity.
I'm going to go to looking at some of the questions we have from the audience. So I can see that some people in the audience are from outside of Australia, and some questions coming in from people based in Bangladesh, which of course is so hello to participants in Bangladesh.
I just want to say all power to Bangladeshi social entrepreneurs. They're amongst the best in the world. Faisal Abed is my absolute hero. The world's largest social enterprise is in Bangladesh, BRAC. It's my absolute pin-up.
BRAC is an amazing organisation for sure. So a question from there. Let me just see if I can understand it. Actually, a couple of questions related to human behaviour and behavioural change. And I personally, this is of great interest to me as well, because if we're talking about systems change, then behavior change, and in Sharpe's 3 Horizon model, it's about patterns and the rules that the unspoken rules that lead us to behave in certain ways as an individual and as collective. So we've got some questions about behavioral change, and I'd love you to share your thoughts on. Let me just see if I can try and capture what's being asked here. So one person's asking, in terms of behavioural change, how are you targeting people on all ends of the spectrum of ideologies? So I think this is such an important issue at the moment, where we have, this kind of rational way of making decisions, and that's a very academic way of making decisions. But of course, people have ideologies where they believe their kind of norms and beliefs that amongst the community that they live drive them to behave in certain ways. So the question is, how would you enact behavioural change for, let's say, climate change issues in a group of university academics, inner city folks, and also rural Australia inclined towards right-wing ideologies? So a huge question there, but kind of thank you for that question, Chetan, because I think that really goes to the heart of systems change and some of the challenges with respect to systems change. You care to comment on that question?
Look, one of the things that excites me most about systems change is it means that there's an incredible diversity, around any table of views and ideologies and religious beliefs. And, if you take STREAT as an organisation, it's like if you've got a team of 120, but it's the United Nations. If you walk into any of our kitchens, you're going to see people from kind of every corner of the world in there. And I think we've got something like 22 different countries we come from, 8 different religions, every color of the, you know, rainbow, the queer rainbow is going to be represented in there. So it's a really interesting mix of people, and I guess I'm really interested in how you create systems where there's the diversity of thought in the process and the solutions that we're coming up with. And what I like about say using a model like Bill Sharp's model, you know, if you use that model very much in a brainstorming sort of way with lots of people, so rather than being, you know, the solo system entrepreneur going through that process is designed as a group process, where you're all going to be coming to the table with very, very different views, and you're going to be going through, you know, all of those yellow squares that were on those 3 different horizons are all, you know, have got a process that goes through them to ask questions, and what you do is you kind of boil up from the bottle, and they kind of bubble away all of those different things and build a very you know, very diverse view. But what you're doing is looking for the trends through that stuff. And I would say the same for anyone who's really interested in, from a process perspective. On one of my slides, the stuff that I had, the kind of thinking about climate change, and I put the CRC for low carbon living. What I'd really recommend doing is going to the CRC for Low Carbon Living website. And that website had the full process of going out very, very broadly to every part of the community. Like it was such an enormous stakeholder process across, I think it was 5 or 7 years that CRC went for. But what they've done is they've documented the full process to get just the maximum number of voices into kind of creating those pathways. And so the process maps of what they did and how they did it are all there. But then it was the accumulation of all of that massive information that then boiled down to then be able to extract kind of, it was the meta-analysis that came out the top. So they're doing a really, really broad scale kind of listening exercise and participatory exercise to get the data, and then extracting from that themes that are running through that. And so that's a similar approach to what we use, that will go out very broadly. So for example, our own climate change work as an organisation, we went out to all of our cafe customers. Now, just to give you a sense, 10,000 people come into our, you know, cafes every week. Well, that was pre-COVID, obviously, but you know, when you've got 10,000 people walking in the door every week, you know, you don't just have people coming in for coffee. You can have a conversation and ask those people a lot of stuff. So for us, we crowdsourced an enormous number of views of our customers and also our staff, and then extracted up from that to work out what was important to our customers and our stakeholders, but then working out kind of where we worked. But yeah, I couldn't recommend strongly enough, I guess, the CRC stuff, because it's a really good example of broad scale participatory process that then from that creates very clear pathways of action, and a very, very clear process of bringing all of those differences in ideology and opinion and you know, approach, surfacing those in very clear ways, rather than having them all kind of buried down.
Okay, excellent. Chetan, I hope that answers your question. For those of you outside of Australia, CRCs are Australia, what we call in Australia, the Cooperative Research Council. Centres. Sorry, I haven't actually spelt it out for a long time. So CRCs, it's a collection of researchers and other stakeholders who have an interest in a particular area, and that one that Beck's referring to is the climate change CRC, right, Beck?
Yeah. Low carbon living.
Carbon living.
Yeah, CRC for low carbon living, and everything they've captured. It's just such an informative website. I've lots of my gold has come from that website.
I've got another question here. I realise that we are now heading beyond 1 hour, but I think it's worth continuing the conversation and trying to answer the other questions that we have here. So this one's from someone, an anonymous person who is thinking about not just SMEs, but thinking about large organisations and corporates, and wants to know about some of the ways that corporates and local government councils can get involved with networked entrepreneurial living and community balanced living.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I would say that probably the way we've scaled most rapidly, particularly in this last 5 years, has been very targeted partnerships with large corporates. So what's really clear is, we don't have a big bank balance, we don't have lots of assets, we're only 10 years old. But what we saw, I guess, is the opportunity to do some fairly large scale work with, inside often some of those large corporates. And an example would be Arup. So, choosing a large kind of global company that's working in areas that we're, highly aligned to the sort of stuff that we're doing. And what we've found is, again and again, often once we're embedded kind of inside a large corporate, and when I say embedded inside, our first relationship will be kind of embedded running the cafe within a corporate. But once you're inside those large corporates, we've found a real ability, I guess, to have many other conversations. So you might start about, how many staff have you got and what coffees do they need? But then the conversation that you can start to have around shared value work, what does that look like to start to create impact together? And often too, what we've found is, there will always be some disruptors or some social entrepreneurs within those organizations. And what we find quite quickly is once we're, up close and personal to those organizations, the social entrepreneurs come out of the woodwork and normally say to us, "Oh my God, you're one of, I'm one of you." And they're the people inside those corporates that are often feel like they're swimming against the tide. They're one of these things is not quite like the others. They're in there trying to do social change inside big corporates. And some of my dearest friends are social entrepreneurs in some of the largest companies in this country. And if I say to them, how the heck do you manage to survive in there? Just come back to the social enterprise sector. They'll say, look, if I can get 1% of change in this large corporate that's a $5 billion business, well then I can do more on the inside of those organizations than I can as a little social entrepreneur on the outside. So my strategy has very much been to get close enough to the corporates that you can spot the social entrepreneurs, and then you start working with those social entrepreneurs. And sometimes they're not even in power, positions of power or influence. Often they're people that might be just believing strongly in something, and then they just start doing a little bit of work and do a bit more work. Interestingly enough, so I've actually done a map of all of the major corporate relationships that we have and how they started and where they came from. And it would be at least probably 95% of those relationships have been instigated by a woman, and it's nearly always women social entrepreneurs in those corporates that are bringing about the change. So if we're doing anything with them, it's nearly always an extraordinary woman or group of women inside, and often they're under the radar. That first work is really under the radar for them. Until kind of some man at the top of the organization might spot it and say, do more of that. So we've got a decade of seeing that being the case often, that it's coming from the ground up, not the top down in many of those corporates. Having said that, we're now being fairly proactive in going directly to some of those corporates and saying, that rooftop that you've got, that's sitting empty, how about you give it to us and we start to make it part of our great big urban farm. What we're dreaming of is a great big distributed urban farm across the CBD. So, I might go and have a knock on a door of, ANZ and say, by the way, can we have your rooftop because we want to turn it into an olive grove? Or I might say to another major corporate, can we have your rooftop because we want our citrus grove up there? So sometimes we're getting to a point, I guess, where there's, we've got enough scale that we can have those conversations at a high enough level. But at the moment, what we're doing is essentially starting to work on the citywide plan, and that will be very proactively going out to major corporates, inviting them, to be part of it. From a local government perspective, local government gets me really excited, because that's often, that's the interface directly with, community members. And so if there was one level of government that I liked probably working with most, it's probably local government, because you can really get down at the household level with a local government. So at the moment, there's some work that's starting to be done across a whole bunch of the local governments to develop their first food strategies. So I would want, Moving Feast to be absolutely embedded in all of those food strategies as a partner for them. We've had our very first local government in Victoria just develop its first social enterprise strategy and get it out this last week. So often you're just trying to find the hook, the hook into those organisations, but nearly always it starts with a kick-ass person who wants to do good within their system, and often a kick-ass social entrepreneur who most of the time ends up being a woman in our experience.
I love, there was a paper written on what I think of as social entrepreneurs, and they called people working in corporates activists in suits.
Totally.
And there's a lot of those people working in corporates around the world who are, the social entrepreneurs. Beck, I'm just conscious of time and your time. It's 8 minutes past the hour. How are you going? Do you have time for one or two more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. I'd love that. Someone from Bangladesh has said here, this is related to behaviour change. They're saying that one of the things they did in Bangladesh in these pandemic times is to gift soap in a relief basket to the poor, and as a way of changing behaviour. So that's an example of something that's happening in Bangladesh with respect to behaviour change. There's another question here about influencing policy, public policy. You've touched on this, talking about your experience with local government and something very recently where, you've had success with local government in Victoria. How do you go about influencing public policymakers and government as an engine?
I'm a highly impatient social entrepreneur that has spent way too many years in ministerial roundtables and talking to ministers, and you can't. I don't know if you can see. There's lots and lots of grey, there, and I am constantly frustrated. It's where probably most of my frustration would come from. I've always found it quite easy to kind of get things moving from the ground up, but where I really feel the frustration is at that regime level in the system, particularly with government. So I think our federal government has been utterly missing in action for the last decade on social entrepreneurship. There is just nothing there that gives me glimmers of hope. And I gave up on them, a long time ago. I stopped spending a lot of my time having conversations, years ago. From a state government level, certainly we're lucky here in Victoria that we've got a Labor government that has been quite progressive around social enterprise. So we've spent a lot of time working with state government, particularly kind of trying to get them aware of the problems and that the social enterprise sector can solve. So there's, great strategy there with some really game-changing social procurement work in particular. And that's really, I think, getting some traction. But, having said that, across 10 years, 0.6% of STREAT's budget has come from government. And that's all three levels of government. There is virtually no credit that I can give government for, any of the work that we've done, yet we've saved government over $20 million, in the last 10 years in direct service delivery with our young people. So we create enormous value for government, but many of the social enterprises, in any state, not just Victoria, have found, a real square peg round wholeness to their work, because most of us, as soon as you start working in system work and you're trying to address complex problems, the work that you're doing doesn't fit neatly into one department. It doesn't silo easily because you're trying to work across it. And where I think we often see, so much of the problem that we've got is the fragmentation of where money flows and how problems, get solved by government. So often we're building our enterprises because there's been a system failure, that the current system isn't working, and so we build social enterprises to address those problems. And so, like all states, we've got a highly fragmented service system, but I still spend a lot of time with state government and local government. But I never see innovation coming from government. I see government normally comes to the table reluctantly. They're never the first in to do innovation, or rarely, in my experience. They're often dragged to the table, and something's got to be safe and risk-free by the time they get behind it. So, even if, we once went for a large innovation grant for the state government, and were told that we were too innovative for the innovation grant. So I guess what I've found is, the way that we've always powered our innovation is, realistically at the front end, it's been philanthropy. That's always been the hero. Then we build our own strong businesses, and within 3 to 5 years expect those businesses to be funding our social and environmental change. And then I normally try and scale that work with impact investment. But government has been almost invisible through that 10 years of stuff that we've done to date. And sadly, I would say the same for moving feast to date. So all the work that we've done in the last 6 months, even though we've been solving some fairly major problems, all of that work has been funded by philanthropy. We still don't have a cent yet of government funding in the mix. So once again, they're fairly slow to the table.
Yeah, wow, interesting. I heard Muhammad Yunus speak recently, and his view is that the stimulus that governments are providing around the world at the moment, not surprisingly, his view is that all of that stimulus funding should be going to social enterprise.
Well, because, it should be. No, but we build the commons. When we build our things, we build sustainable business models to bring about long-term systemic problems, and we do it to not profiting ourselves. Whereas, to do things any other way ends up that the same inequalities that we've got now get perpetuated through that funding. We either put the funding out there and it keeps on being a Band-Aid. If we keep just doing food relief for the next however long, that's just a Band-Aid solution. It's not a systemic solution. Or we give, every socioeconomic group that's struggling right now, what we're doing is giving them Coles and Woolies vouchers. Well, how the fuck does that help the system? That doesn't change the system to be a better system. It just perpetuates the same stuff. So I think, to be fair, the speed at which the government needed to make the changes was rapid. So of course, whatever you put out there is going to be a blunt instrument. but we know that if we invest in social enterprises to solve problems, it's one of our most effective ways to bring about long-term systemic change. So, I mean, our task is to get our act together as social entrepreneurs and get our shit together collectively and say, you know what, we're capable and we've got capacity, and so I don't expect them to be able to hand over large amounts of money unless they can see our capability. And that's what we're trying to do with Moving Feast, going, hey, don't underestimate us. We've got some real skill and capability here, and see us as your greatest allies to solving the most complex problems that this country has.
Well, Beck, I love that you have got your shit together and that you've created Fit Moving Feast. You had your shit together with STREAT and in Cyro, but Moving Feast is really exciting and really, I think, inspirational and visionary around trying to change food systems in Victoria. So thank you so much for sharing a little bit of what you're up to, because I know it's just like tip of the iceberg what we've heard today. And it's been just fascinating. Thank you to our participants online and those who are still with us. For those of you who are interested in other webinars in this series, as I said at the beginning, this is the first in our webinar series called SICON, Social Innovation Conference. The next one is on the 4th of August, and on the 4th of August is actually Nazia Ahmed, who's the director and founder of the Social Outcomes Lab. And she is hosting Daniela and Kate. Kate is from STREAT, and Daniela is from the co-founder of Crofme, which is, so two social enterprises there. So both Kate and Daniela will join Nazia in the next one on the 4th of August. So we'll leave it there today. Thank you to the participants who asked some great questions. Thank you for joining us. And for those of you who are going to listen to this on the recording, you now know a little bit about Moving Feast, and I'm sure it's not the last we're going to hear about Moving Feast with Beck Scott and her approach to systems entrepreneurship and all of the collective entrepreneurs that are working together in Melbourne and Victoria. So all the best, Beck, and congratulations to you and the team down there for getting Moving Feast off the ground in such trying circumstances and using the pandemic as an opportunity to bring about food justice and trying to make the food system more sustainable in Victoria. Did you want to say anything else before we finish up today, Beck?
No, well, yeah, sure. Just don't underestimate just your power as an individual to start to be, one of those people at the niche level starting to bring about change. And, lots of people say to me, well, does it mean, giving up my day job and going and becoming a social entrepreneur? It doesn't, but it means rolling your sleeves up or making deliberate decisions when you open your wallet to buy something. All of that is part of the change. So to all of those, everyone around the world who's having a really tough time at the moment, I guess I would say, do the little bit that you can wherever you are, whether or not you're in lockdown in your house, but stay strong and sane. And thanks for your work for working towards a fair and just and safe future for all of us.
Fantastic. On that note, we will sign off. Thank you so much again, Beck. And please stay safe, everybody. And as Beck said, wherever you are in the world, I hope you're staying safe. And let's continue the conversation and work together over the years around social innovation. So thanks, Beck.
See you. Thank you.